That's just an extra freebie, right? Hey, if you haven't been to these classes before, you can pick up the early ones on my websites. I've got a YouTube site. Also, there's a link from Holy Cross where I also teach similar classes, because I don't teach, this is history. So if you haven't been to this class before, I do not teach doctrine or theology or any of that kind of stuff at all. We're looking at the Acts of the Apostles as a historical document, and within this cultural context and historical context and literary context. As you'll see, I'll probably go into too much detail about the Greek words, but that's okay. And the fun thing about a class like this is you can actually see what the Greek says to a large degree, and that's what I try to do. But in any case, we've gotten to the point where we can talk about some of the details of the Acts of the Apostles, because the first class we did, we got into the culture, what is the culture in the Greek period, what is, this Judeo-Roman, Greek, Greco-Roman, Greco-Hebraic culture that we're talking about in the first century. The second class, we talked about the veracity of the text, so we proved the veracity of the text. And the third class, we basically looked at the Greek form of literature that Acts of the Apostles is. It's the Greek logos to telos. All ancient Greek literature is logos to telos form, which is an argument to broadly a conclusion. A conclusion is not really the correct translation of telos, but that's okay. It's close enough for us. But in any case, this one is Hagios Pneuma. And the reason I call it Hagios Pneuma, it actually is the first section of Acts. But the whole first section of Acts is about Hagios Pneuma, and we'll find out what that is in a moment. And also, if you remember from last week, the logos to telos of the Acts of the Apostles is the acting of the Hagios Pneuma. So what is that? Here are the words of the day. Oh, they're Greek. Hagios Pneuma glossa, kledon, omphe, solokitsin, I can't pronounce that, apophthologomeia, dialectos ecclesia. Ancient Greek pronunciation, I don't have to speak it, right? So I know what the words mean. Hagios is a really interesting word in Greek. This is a sacred word. Remember I told you there's sacred words and there's profane words. There's words that are sacred in Greek thought and words that are common, profane. The word, we use the word profane. Doesn't mean they're profanity. It means they're just used commonly. But hagios, from hagos, an awful thing. Now this comes, I'm giving you Strong's, probably not the best thing in the whole world, but it's pretty close to a Woodhouse, which is the classical Greek. But in any case, hagios is only applied to supernatural minions of the gods. We get the word in English, hag, from it. Anybody want to venture what a hagios is? You guys know about it. They're in Greek mythology all over the place.
Old woman.
Yeah. Yeah. Think demigods. Think demigods. I don't think there's any witches in Greek mythology. There are demigods, Medusa, right? The Sphinx. Remember Oedipus Rex met the Sphinx, half woman, half lion, half eagle. Well, halfy, third. In any case, that's a hagios. Now, what does Paul constantly refer to the people as in the New Testament documents? Anybody want to venture a guess? If you haven't read your Greek, then you don't know, right? He calls them saints. That's a translation of hagios. He calls them awful things. And actually, when we say awful thing, the reason it's an awful thing, well, Medusa is a pretty awful thing, and a sphinx is a pretty awful thing. In Greek thought, when you saw them, what did you do? You were in awe and you fell on your face. They were so awful. Remember the Medusa, if you looked at her, you turned to stone. So what did you do to prevent from looking at her? You fell on your face. You prostrated yourself on your face. That's how awful, because they were the minions of the gods. In Greek thought, they're demigods. Where does Paul call these guys demigods? But that's a whole other question. We're not talking about Paul's letters. We're talking about Luke's Acts of the Apostles. This is a supernatural word, a sacred word, only applied to supernatural. Now, pneuma, literally a current of air. It is a breath, and let me give you what kind of breath it is. In Greek thought, human beings are made of three parts. The sarx, the flesh, the pneuma, which is the breath that is the breath that is voluntary. A pneuma is a voluntary breath. And what's the third one? Sarx, pneuma, and the spirit. What's the other one? The other spirit. Anyway, in Greek, I want to say pieces, but it's not pieces. That's faith. That's belief, convincing. Sarx, pneuma. Kind of flashed right out of my brain. It'll come back. But in any case, that is an involuntary breath. And what the Greeks attributed it is sarx is your flesh. The involuntary breath is literally the breath of life, of Zoe. That is what makes you alive. And the pneuma is what makes you a human being, as a soul. So one is intellect, that is the involuntary is intellect. The voluntary is the soul. And it's all mixed up in Greek thought, so it's kind of complicated. But the point is that a pneuma is literally a spirit, that is a soul. It is a sacred word, and human beings have it, which is unique, because in Hebrew thought, do human beings have a soul? Not really. You go look back in the Old Testament, God created man. He created him from the dust of the earth, is sarx. And he created him with a breath from his lungs. But guess what? The breath was not a soul. It was simply an animation. However, in the New Testament, and if you had my apocryphal class, where did we get this idea about the soul? That's a Pharisaic idea. Remember, the Sadducees did not believe. Remember those 5 sects of Judaism I talked about? The 4 main ones: Sadducees, Pharisees, Essenes, and Zealots. The Pharisees believed in a soul. They're pretty Hellenized. The Sadducees did not believe in a soul. The Sadducees were the priests. Modern Jews believe in a soul-ish. So they've kind of accepted Hellenization all the way down the line. Isn't that interesting? In any case, Hagios Pneuma is a transliteration of the Hebrew Ruach Kodesh, which means literally the exhalation of God from the most holy place. Translated Holy Spirit. So in the beginning was God's, actually Elohim with a singular verb. That always hits people in the middle of the forehead. That's what it says. In the beginnings was God's, Elohim, with a singular verb. And the Ruach of God was over the waters. But the Ruach is not what he put in Adam. It was Atom. It's a little complicated there, but we're not talking about Genesis, we're talking about Acts. In any case, Ruach Kodesh is the transliteration of that into Greek is awful breath of God, or Holy Spirit. So if you have bad breath, you have Ruach, you have Hagios Pneuma, right? This is the word glossa. Glossa is translated literally tongue. It's one of the few words that is euphemistic in Greek. Greek is mostly a concrete language, very little euphemism. But tongue euphemistically means a language. It's translated as tongues or language. It's a profane word, and we'll see it translated both ways in NIV. It's also in the King James, similar. It means understandable speech in a knowable language. Here's the word that means non-understandable speech in an unknown language. Kladon. Kladon is the prophetic voice of an oracle. Remember, there's 5 oracles in the Greek worldview. One of them is at Delphi, but there's 4 others. And sorry, I can't remember where they are. It might be in my notes someplace. But in any case, I didn't bring my big notes. Usually I have about 100 pages of notes for these classes. But there are 4 other oracles. One is in Alexandria. One is in Olympus. Alexandria. Let's see, maybe I can remember. Olympus, Alexandria, Delphi. And there's 2 others. I think one's in Thebes and one's in Macedon. In any case, Kladon is a sacred word. This is that poor girl who sniffed the drug-laden, or actually, I think it was methane-laden gases from Delphi and went to a frenzy, in which many times they died. And she spoke Kladon, literally the prophetic voice of the oracle. So it was not understandable speech. Guess what? You don't find this in the New Testament. Guess who interpreted? Well, the oracles originally interpreted their things, and it was pretty accurate in their prophecies until the Athenians took over Delphi, and then guess who interpreted for the oracle? The priests started to interpret, and then the prophecies weren't as accurate, but they were always good for Athens. So, she said, "Give us all your money, Sparta," right? Omphe is another prophetic voice from the god, words or language of a god. Basically, it's a sacred word and a mystery religion word, Omphe. It shows direct speech from the gods, which was a common part of Greek religion. I think I mentioned to you that we found inside of Greek statues, there are sound cones in the mouths, and we believe that they may have originated as ways of making sounds. Like, for example, when the wind blew across them, they make some sound. But the priests really quickly figured out that, hey, if I stand behind the head of the god and speak through the sound cone, guess what? I can speak for the gods, and the people will believe me. Oh, boy. Because remember, in every Greek temple, what is there in the sacred place? A statue of the god. Always. This is a direct speech to the gods. Words that are not spoken by a human and may or may not be understandable. So if Paul ever meant to mean, if he ever meant to mean in the New Testament documents a speech that is unintelligible, what word would he use? Omphe or kledon. He would never use the word glossa, because glossa means an understandable word. And not only that, we have this word, solikizian, a language spoken badly or incoherently. This is also a common word in Greek. We also have this, and the reason I'm giving you these words is because we'll see them in the Acts, which is really neat. But this apophthegmai, okay. To enunciate plainly, which I didn't, right? To declare, speak forth, meaning basically to speak clearly. You also have a word dialectos, which means we get the word dialect from it, but means a language, literally a language in Greek. So, in any case, ecclesia. I gotta finally mention this word. This is a very important word because we will see it used for the first time in Acts. By the way, by Stephen talking about the Hebrews. What did the Hebrews have for their assembly? What is it called in Greek? No, it's called synagogue. Synagogue is a Greek word. Ha ha ha, isn't that cute? There's no Hebrew word for assembly. The Hebrew word is a Greek word that was borrowed in the apocryphal period. And so synagogue is a Greek word, meaning sune, gogia. Sune, meaning together, gogia, led together. Ecclesia means calling out. An ecclesia is a type of assembly. It is only used classically for the Athenian democracy. The Athenian democracy is the ecclesia. It's one of the many Greek words for assembly. There's like 10 or 12 that we know, but there are many more than that because every Greek assembly had a name. There's the assembly in the marketplace, and the assembly for the politics of the Spartans, and for the Thebans, and for the Macedonians, and for these guys, and those guys, and the other guys. And, when ladies get together, they have a name for that. And when, the Jews get together, right, it's a synagogue. There are many, many names in Greek for types of assembly. Each Greek region had its own, but the Athenian democracy was the only one called an ecclesia. And they are the only ones who had a democracy. So in classical Greek, like I said, it's only used for the Athenian democracy. This drives classical Greek scholars crazy. Can you see this? Because what did the early church call themselves?
The way.
They called their assembly the ecclesia. But you're right, they called themselves tin hodos. They called themselves the way, which is also a transliteration from Hebrew, from Malachi. But the big deal was they called their assembly the called out. What were they called out of? Did somebody say it? The synagogue. They weren't called out of common life, they were called out of the synagogue. Because the synagogue met on what day? Sabbath, Shabbat, on Saturday. When did the ecclesia meet? Sunday. And Saturday. Right? Because these guys were Tinodos. They're one of the sects of Judaism. They're not mainly Gentiles. We'll find out about Gentiles next week. The big deal is that whenever you see this word ecclesia, usually translated church in the New Testament, it means the Athenian democracy, and whatever the Athenian democracy means. Let's talk about that just quickly. The Athenian democracy, no leader, right? Peerless. Everyone's equal. Everyone has an equal vote, including women and slaves, right? No. There's no slaves or women in the Athenian democracy, but guess what the church had? Right? Everyone is supposed to be equal, right? Peerless. I mean, this is truly peerless. Don't you see why this drives classical scholars crazy? Very interesting, isn't it? And also, totally anti-culture. Totally anti-culture. Let's look at Acts. Beginning of the Acts 2. We've been through Acts 1, the introduction. You know, there is no introduction, right? But there is a small prologue, very similar to Herodotus, at the beginning of the Acts. We talked about that last week. This is, too, really the beginning of the action. When the day of Pentecost came, they're all together in one place, and suddenly a sound like the blowing of a violent wind, a pnoe, a pnoe. Pneuma, remember pneuma? A breath, and a voluntary breath. A pnoe is a violent wind, came from the heaven, literally the place of the gods, filled the whole house where they're sitting. They saw what seemed to be glossa, literally tongues of fire, that separated and came to rest on each of them. I didn't parse everything in Greek here. All of them were filled with the Hagios Pneuma. Remember the problem that I told you about in the Old Testament? What did God made man out of dust, sarx. He put in him the breath of life, right? But not his breath. But at Passover, at Pentecost, he put what into these men? His Holy Spirit. Do you see this? What a powerful expression of difference. You see what the Old Testament guy is like? Old Testament man has only what? Flesh and the breath of life within him. But the New Testament man now has the Holy Spirit of God. You see this? The finalization of the creation in the view of Jewish thought, Christian thought, whatever kind of thought you want. This is Tinodos. All of Philip began to do lelo. This lelo is an interesting word because they're not doing legos, are they? They're not doing arguments. They're doing lelo. Very important because lelo is conversation. In other words, if I suddenly were able to speak in another language and we're giving you a logical discourse, that's one thing. But if I'm sitting there and conversing with you, as in small talk, what's that mean? I'm understanding it, right? I'm not just, it's not just the blast of the gods, I'm right? I'm actually conversing with you. You're saying, hi, how are you? And I'm saying, I'm great, how are you? Right? You see this? They're leloing. So, unfortunately, in English we get speak, but it's lelo in Greek. In other tongues, glossa, this is the used languages, as the pneuma enabled them. And look at this. Apolognomai, which means speaking clearly to them. You get it 5 ways, right? It's very clear that what they're trying to tell you is something special because why do you think the author of Acts went to such lengths to make this very clear to you that they were speaking clearly in language that could be understood in conversation, like conversational French? Why? Very commonly in the ancient world. Okay, look. The Greeks have at least 2 words, actually have more, 2 words that mean non-understandable speech, kleidon and umphi, that's used in a religious ceremony. Right? 2 words. How common is it for Greeks to have unintelligible speech during their religious ceremonies? Pretty darn common, right? Or there wouldn't be so many words for it. You don't need words if you don't do it, right? So guess what? In the ancient world, it's very common to have people speaking frenzied tongues, you know, in ecstasy, in craziness, you know, whatever. It's very common. But guess what? The author of Luke wants to make sure that that is very clearly not what is happening here. It is a speech that is understandable, and not only that, it's conversational speech. Conversational French. Now that we're in Jerusalem, God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. Why? Why? They're there for the Passover. There's seven or six. There's six. I don't have fingers here. There's 6 festivals in Greek thought that come out of the Old Testament. There's a couple of ones that are added, Hanukkah and Purim, but there are basically 6 basic festivals. 3 of them are Pilgrim Fests, and 3 of them are not. Guess what Pentecost is? One of the Pilgrim Festivals. So you got Passover and you got Pentecost, and the other one is booths. Pesach. No, anyway, booths. The Festival of Booths. It's the one that's near at the beginning of the Jewish New Year, which is around November, October. So,
Yom Kippur?
What's that?
Yom Kippur.
Yes, Yom Kippur is the last day of Booths.
Okay.
But those are the 3 pilgrim festivals. And so this is one of the pilgrim festivals. So guess what? All the Jews, remember, Saul was born in Tarsus, right? And if he's a devout Jew, where is he going every pilgrim festival? To Jerusalem. This is why he was in Jerusalem when Jesus Christ was crucified. He was in Jerusalem when Jesus Christ was tried. He was in Jerusalem every year that Jesus was in Jerusalem, every time when Jesus was in Jerusalem, because when was Jesus in Jerusalem? Jesus, as a man, was always there during the 3 pilgrim festivals. That's required by Jewish law. And if you're not, guess what happens? You're cut off from the people forever. There's no sacrifice, there's no forgiveness for that. So in any case, when they heard the sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment because each one heard speaking Layla, conversation, in his own dialectos. Dialectos, in his own clear language. They were utterly amazed. Are not these men all Galileans? Why do you think they could tell they were Galileans?
The way they talk?
Probably because of their outrageous accents, which is another interesting thing, thought. Galileans did not necessarily dress much differently than anybody else. They all dressed pretty similarly. It could have been their dress, but I doubt it. Galileans had an accent, kind of like New Yorkers have an accent, or people from Jersey or from the South, right? They had an accent, and that accent, matter of fact, let me tell you, in German, a lot of American accents come. And have you ever heard German actors speaking with an American accent? It's hilarious. Or how about British actors that speak with an American accent? Well, American actors always try to speak with a British accent and fail, right? But, people have an accent even when they're speaking another language. So it's most likely they had an accent because the Galil was well known for that. If you read my book, Centurion, I mentioned this a couple of times, kind of in passing. How is it that each one of them hears in his own dialectos, language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, everywhere. All these places. Look out. Egypt, Libya, Cyrene, from Rome. They're speaking Latin too. Holy smoke. All these were Jews. These were Jews from the diaspora. And by the way, it said God-fearers, right? Look what it says. God-fearing Jews. That is code word. And see if I can remember it offhand. I did remember it from one of my classes lately, but there are 4 levels of Jews or Gentiles you'll find in a synagogue. They're God-fearers, they're proselytes at the gates, and proselytes at the gates. Anyway, the God-fearers are those guys that have not made a commitment. The second level is, it's what Cornelius was. They're under instruction. The next level are those who are circumcised, but have not gone through the mikvah yet. And the mikvah, the baptism, I talked about that last week. And the final group are, those that are Gentile Jews. They're Jews who have converted from being a Gentile or to a Jew. So you have 4 levels. So guess what this crowd included, do you think? All those groups, yeah. And Jews from the diaspora. That's why they use that code word. In Greek, I should have parsed it, but in Greek it's more clear. It doesn't mean God-fearing Jews, it means God-fearers and Jews. It includes everybody, both Gentiles and Jews that are there for the Pentecost. Because, what? One of the things you had to do to become a Jew is do what? We'll go to the pilgrim festivals, right? And so if you're, well, you know, one of the big negatives is circumcision. Why is a big negative circumcision for Gentiles?
It hurts.
Well, it's not very, you know, pain I don't think is in the equation. What's the big deal?
It's anti-Greek.
It's anti-Greek and it's social ostracism. Because you walk around naked a lot. Okay? In the Greek world, it's you know, men and women don't bathe together, but men bathe together in the baths, women bathe together in the baths. You know, you have your own thing, and guess what? You do the sports stuff naked. In their day, they didn't go watch football; they played football. You know, Greek guys like to do that kind of athletic thing. They did this sauna thing. That, you know, they went to symposiums, hanging around naked, because clothing was kind of an optional thing in the Greek worldview. Okay, so the minute you became circumcised, what did you become identified with? The Jews. And you were socially ostracized. So it was a huge step for a Greek person, a Greek male, to make that step. So you got a lot of guys like Cornelius who did not want to make that step. And remember, we'll find out about this soon, next week, by the way. What was the ruling of the church, of the early church? Gentiles did not have to be circumcised to have the mikvah. The last step of Judaism is the mikvah. The last step of Christianity, of Teen Hodos, is the mikvah. Isn't that interesting? Okay. So, and by the way, they also went through training, just like the Jews did. What do we call the training in Christian circles? Come on, guys. Confirmation, right? In the ancient world, you wouldn't baptize them until after they got finished with confirmation. It's only in the modern world we baptize them before. We get them in the door, see? In any case, what does this mean? Some made fun of, said they have had too much wine. That's funny. Anyway, he stood up with them, he raised his voice and addressed them directly in clear words. The crowd said, fellow Jews and all who live in this, listen to what Rima. I'm going to tell you a story. Rima's story. I'm going to tell you a story. It's not a logos, it's a story. They're not drink, it's only 9 in the morning. And by the way, the word used is new wine, which means cheap wine. Anyway, here's this stuff, the prophecy, afterwards I was brought the people. This is just, you know, Paul, this is Peter's speech to the people, etc., etc. They were cut to the quick because what Peter said was true, and the people all knew what had happened in Jerusalem. Why did they all know what had happened in Jerusalem? Why? They were there. They were there. Okay? Because they probably came for both the Passover and the Pentecost, right? The Pesach and for the Pentecost.